Okay, stream is up, I assume? Yes. So any questions from you guys about anything before we start today? All right. This is a repeat for you guys, but for the sake of my online class, I should bring this up. There we go. So as a reminder, here we are today. We've only got like a week and a half class left, and then like a day here, and then a day in December. So, as just for the online folks, test 3 will be the final. So don't be expecting us to try to squeeze in test 3 somehow in here and then have enough material for the final. I am starting to see, like, schedule-wise, why some professors do cumulative stuff. It's like you just do the 3 tests, and then the final will be bits and pieces from that, but that's not how I do, so you don't have to worry about it. Also, as a reminder, this is when your final paper is due. What is that now? Whoop, 24th? Yeah. No, 25th of November. So if you need to get that done, if you need to have a grade dropped, you probably ought to do it. As a reminder, the default topic is a person in the revolution and how they were important in said revolution. If you're doing somebody like, say, George Washington, I don't want their life story, just what they did in the revolution. If it's somebody a little bit less famous, then you're welcome to give us a bit more about their life before the actual revolution. That said, you can do anything between basically the revolution and really the Civil War. We're not going to actually get that far this semester, unfortunately, but if you want to read ahead a little bit past the War of 1812, you're welcome to. Okay. Also, let's go ahead and grab this before I leave it up there and it gets in the way. We also have the exam schedule. Let's try that again. Up here. There we are. So, let's zoom in a little bit. It's mostly important for you guys here. Actually, let me pull this back up again. I'm bring that over here. We'll use that as we need. So, for us, where am I? Monday, Wednesday, 8:30, that's us. So our exam will be in here on the 4th. It's normal time for us. Well, actually, it's a little bit longer, but you won't need that extra time, but you'll have it if you do need it, I guess. So just pulling that up. Yeah, so it'll be like the first day of, that's reading day. First day of exams, Wednesday the 4th. So just come in here and you'll just take the exam like you've taken every other test. For my online folks, I'll probably put it up the previous day. This is reading day, which is when we all have the day off. So if you have a Tuesday, Thursday class, presumably you won't be here that day. I don't know of any professor that would actually have class on reading day. This is the have a last minute panic and contact your professor and bug them all day. But there's only a week after that for exams to be done, and then I have to have grades in. So for my online people, I'll probably put it up a day early, because if you don't have it in within a week, you're out of luck. So for those of you that have made things difficult for me, I cannot extend it past this day. So online people, please do your freaking exam within this week. Normally, like my other 2 classes, their exams are actually on these days. I would offer you guys to be able to come in a different day if you need to. Well, I guess, yeah, if you can't come in that Wednesday, I'm going to also be here Monday and Tuesday of the next week during the same time period. So if you need to come in on a different day, let me know. For the most part, though, people want to go ahead and get it done as early as possible, and this class is on the earliest possible day. So in here at 8:30, really about as normal as it can be for an exam. Everybody else's exams are at 8:30 as well, even for classes that aren't at 8:30, so it gets kind of weird. But for us, it doesn't matter.
I have a question.
Yes.
Will we get a study guide for the final exam?
Yes, in fact, our last day of class is this Monday. So again, for Tuesday, Thursday, I've got to actually push it back to November. But for us, we will come back in that Monday after Thanksgiving, and that will be our review day. So I will 100% dedicate this to review, which means we need to get the next chapter and a half done within like a week, and we do have an extra day here, so if all else fails, I can cram stuff on that day. But we should be fine. My biggest problem is my other classes are really far ahead, and I've got to like pad things out. For us, we're pretty much right on schedule. But yeah, so we will 100% have review day. That will be after Thanksgiving, so please come to class once we have Thanksgiving break done that next Monday. And again, just to reiterate, the Monday of Thanksgiving break, we still have class, and that's when the papers due. So please have those in. Again, for you guys, if you can bring them in physically, that will be preferred. If you can't, just email them to me, and I will try to get them done over Thanksgiving break. All right, any other questions? Cool. All right. So yeah, we're about halfway through chapter 8 right now, so we should be able to knock it out today. And let me just grab this again. Yoink. And then next week, and then the extra day we have should be enough for chapter 9. And then we'll have everything ready for the exam. So, this is where we ended. It was at the very end of class, so I'll briefly go over it again. With the Louisiana Territory being acquired, as I mentioned, the biggest pushback against purchasing the Louisiana Territory was Jefferson. Everybody else was totally cool with it. And the only reason he was pushing back against it because it was technically not a provision in the Constitution. But he also really wanted this land. So we got Louisiana Territory. The Corps of Discovery, that's the pretty well-known story. Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea. Also York, the slave that worked under Clark as a scout. And then Zebulon Pike down here that I definitely wanted to include because, as I said, he's got a fun name. He named, where are we at? We got Pike's Peak over here. But more importantly, he got himself captured, and they led him through Mexico on the way back to American territory. And they were pretty chill with him, and he overheard, that they were planning on rebelling against Spain, and also was able to some degree, scout out what would eventually be Southwest America. In fact, we'll get into this whole overthrowing Spanish rule thing in just a little bit. No, wait. I think that might be the next chapter. I might be getting ahead of myself. Anyway, so with the Supreme Court, did I get into that already? Yeah, no. At the end of Adams' presidency, it was going to be clear that the Federalists were going to be pretty much out of a job in the American government. So with the Judiciary Act, he created more circuit courts and 60 new judges, which he then filled, so they were, of course, Federalist judges. James Madison refused to accept these commissions, which led to the Marbury v. Madison court case. The Supreme Court essentially said that it couldn't force the executive branch to do its job, but they had the duty to, quote, say what the law was, which wasn't really written in stone before this point. And since this is specifically a court, any proceedings and decisions basically then become precedent. Similar with the court claiming the next year that they could rule on the constitutionality of state laws, which gave the federal court much more reach. McCulloch v. Maryland had a similar loose interpretation where the government could, quote, make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. This was specifically using the federal power to create the First National Bank. And while the Democratic Republicans opposed the creation of the First National Bank, they did charter the Second National Bank in 1816. So while they were against the National Bank on principle, due to, again, it not technically being allowed in the Constitution, or should I say not specifically allowed in the Constitution. Should choose my words a little bit better. They realized it was good for the country, and so in 1816, when the charter of the First National Bank was set to expire, they rechartered it as the Second National Bank. This is where McCulloch v. Maryland comes from. Maryland wanted to tax branch banks from the federal government, and the Supreme Court said that they could not because, to quote them, the power to tax involves the power to destroy, because, well, if a state can tax a federal bank, then they can literally tax it out of existence. Like, that is an implied power of taxation. And finally, we have John Marshall, who established the power of judicial review, which allowed the court to rule on cases involving states and the nation. So once again, giving the Supreme Court more power than just like keeping the executive and legislative branches running smoothly. They now were able to sit on any decision when it comes to state or national laws. So Judiciary Act, this is the passed again by the Federalists, which created more judgeships, to attempt to maintain control of the judiciary branch, the Supreme Court. And this is just an example of how many Supreme Court decisions aren't unanimous. If it's a 5-4 decision, it's considered constitutional, but that could mean that later on down the road, that ratio may shift and the decision be rescinded. And again, we had the National Bank was necessary to carry out Congress's power to tax, and Maryland was attempting to resist the National Bank within their state. So, again, Democratic Republicans, being the opposite of the Federalists, were all about not having a powerful central government, yet within the reign of Jefferson, the federal government did, in fact, gain a lot more power. Between 1802 and 1811, the Royal Navy was impressing more sailors into their navy. So once again, this problem of impressment continues, even though we've had our independence now for going on 30 years by 1811. More than 8,000 sailors were forced into royal service, which as I may have mentioned, because France and England were fighting each other. There were a lot of naval deserters getting out of the English Royal Navy and trying to find jobs elsewhere, and often the best place for an ex-sailor to find a job is aboard a ship. So England claimed that they were coming in to look for deserters and pull them off of American ships and force them back into the Navy. But it's not like they had, IDs and fingerprints and all of that back then. It was just a case of, hey, you look English enough, we're going to force you into naval service. So one of the ways that America responded to this was with the Embargo Act. U.S. ships were prohibited from leaving home ports until France and Britain ended their own trade restrictions, because while they were obviously at war with one another, they were attempting to influence American policies. Now, making it so that American ships can't even leave port is going to really hurt international trade, because, well, you can't trade internationally without using ships. Today you can do that to some degree with planes, but you can send so much more overseas. If we shut down all our ports, we wouldn't have an economy left. There was even just, the Suez Canal was blocked for, a week, and it horribly affected the world economy just because we had to, move things further out, and the way our manufacturing is now, where we only have enough to supply the immediate moment and just ship stuff in so that we're not having stuff sitting in warehouses. Anyway, this immediately affected the economy, particularly merchants in New England. So in response to an embargo act, they began smuggling through Canada. This is starting to sound familiar. And to respond to the smuggling, Congress passed the Force Act, which expanded federal power to literally use military force to stop the smuggling. Once again, this is sounding a lot like pre-1776 America. Now, it wasn't just merchants that suffered from the embargo. Farmers, planters, urban workers, and then, of course, sailors and dock workers who were working with the ships and the docks also were all harmed because, again, we are in a time of international trade. You can't survive by being isolationist, despite the fact that some people don't know what a tariff is. But, it's not doable. It wasn't doable back then, and certainly isn't today. Obviously, people didn't appreciate what Jefferson was doing for more than one reason. Obviously, these embargo acts are hurting the economy, but he's doing the exact opposite of what he said he was going to do. They elected him because he was going to limit the power of the federal government. Yet under Jefferson, the federal government became more powerful. And then, of course, the Embargo Act harming people's livelihoods. And then we have what has to be one of the best images, definitely in this chapter, perhaps in the entire semester, and that's the embargo turtle. It's in the book. It's not as heavily inked in the book. The lines aren't as dark, but the same image is in the book. It says, "Damn it, how it nicks him." And over here, this curse Agrabme, which is embargo spelled backwards. They were being real creative with the naming. So yeah, that's the embargo turtle, whose name is just embargo spelled backwards. And there's a later image that I didn't include in the PowerPoint, so I apologize for that. But when the embargo is rescinded, there's a picture of the embargo turtle basically on his back and split open, like it had been killed with the embargo being lifted. But yeah, that's a whole thing. I mean, and as you can see here, they're trading with British ships, which was not allowed under the embargo, so it making things much more difficult for people trying to sell overseas, I should say. Once again, I was running out of room, so that's pushed up at the top. Sorry about that. U.S. population grows and migrates. By 1820, a quarter of non-Native Americans lived west of the Appalachians, which is pretty substantial considering, there was this whole thing about using that territory and the trouble it was causing with relations with Native Americans, which, needless to say, that's going to be a thing. Obviously, most people lived in rural areas. That's been the case since like 1600 at this point. But cities were growing substantially. New York and Philadelphia reaching about 100,000 residents, with immigrants as a very, very large minority, because typically when people come in from overseas, they often stay in the city that they arrive in, especially, again, back then when travel was expensive and difficult. You might as well stay where you ended up. Now, I know 100,000 isn't much of anything nowadays, but back then that was like a metropolis. We also had cities appearing on the frontier. Obviously, New Orleans, which has been around since France made their way down the Mississippi, so it's been there a while now. And also Cincinnati, which grew due to its location on, I want to say, the Ohio River? Cincinnati is not on this map. Anyway, increased in size, and this encouraged more people to migrate west. Because unlike what we're going to see next semester with the post-Civil War westward expansion, where it's just like people are going over in wagon trains and everything's, real rugged, and they've got their little frontier houses. With this, you can go west and make your little frontier house and, rough it in the forest and piss off the natives. Or you can head west and still enjoy the city life. Still go to, say, New Orleans and Cincinnati, which began as frontier towns and then quickly exploded into major cities. Also, once again, Cincinnati being named after Cincinnatus, who was a Roman, he was just like a farmer that was elected as dictator to help with a particular war, and then after the war, he still had time in his term as a dictator to do whatever he wanted, but instead of doing that, he returned power to the Senate and returned to his life as a farmer, and that was the model that Washington took, because after his second term, he just stepped down. There was no two-term limit back then. In fact, there wasn't a two-term limit until the mid-1900s. It was just once Washington stepped down after 2 terms, that was considered the norm, and we should all emulate Washington. But he could have been president as long as he wanted. But he decided, 8 years is plenty. I'm going to go back to my farm and do my thing. His farm, of course, being a plantation that he didn't actually do any work on because he had lots of slaves. But, it's the thought that counts, I guess. Obviously, all these people heading west caused conflicts with the people who are already there, the Native Americans, obviously, as well as the French settlers and Spanish planters, because while, yes, Louisiana had been sold to us, that didn't mean that every French person there packed up and moved out. And then also, of course, the Spanish along the southern part, because while we did get to the Mississippi River, right on the other side is still Spanish territory. So to maintain any kind of internal cohesion, we needed roads, and in particular, turnpikes, which are roads paid for by, well, the tolls. A turnpike is actually a medieval term where there would be roads that you'd have to pay a toll on, and before you could get on the road, there'd be two dudes standing there literally with medieval pikes that they would cross in front of it, and once you paid your toll, they'd lift them and let you through. That's literally where the, like if you leave out of a parking garage or something, that little arm that comes down, that's what that is. That's an ancient medieval pike that was used to block the road, so you had to pay your toll before you went through. And it's just now this little arm we have today. Not a lot changed besides the fact we don't have to make a dude stand there and, be bored to tears all day. So with the Lancaster Turnpike was a major step forward, but before that, it cost as much to move wheat 62 miles overland to Philadelphia as it did to put that wheat on a ship and sail it from Philadelphia all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to London, because overland travel sucked. When we get into the next chapter, we'll talk about the Erie Canal and how much that changed everything. But we're a little behind. We're not quite there yet. Albert Gallatin, who I said we were going to get back to, he was the one who was helping Jefferson to fund these internal improvements, such as, again, roads and canals. We'll get to the canals in a little bit, well, next time. But for now, it's mostly roads, such as a national road from Maryland through southern Pennsylvania to West Virginia. It eventually made its way to Ohio and Illinois. The national road, also known as the Cumberland Road, because it went through the Cumberland Gap in the Appalachians, was a major improvement in terms of getting people from the coast to at least the Midwest. Robert Fulton, he didn't invent the steamboat, but his steamboat, the Clermont, was the first successful steamboat. He used the steam engine plans from Oliver Evans, which, again, steam engines have been around since like at least the 1700s, but they were not very efficient. And over time, more and more people worked on them and made them more efficient. And also got funding from Robert Livingston in Paris, and eventually created the Clermont, which rapidly changed how things were shipped in America. Because now, as I have said a couple of times when we're talking about like rivers, if you wanted to ship things, you typically would want to be on a river. You'd build a raft. You'd put all your stuff on the raft, and you often like hire somebody to be on the raft and basically pole barge it down river to the city at the mouth of the river, which in the case of Mississippi would be New Orleans. But once you got there and you sold the stuff, and usually also took the raft apart and sold the timber that the raft was made of, you had to come back by land. Either you walk or you hopefully find a carriage, but that was it. There was no shipping up river, except now we have steamboats. And steamboats can power their way up rivers. Not especially fast, but slow is still faster than not at all. So this made things much more efficient. And also when it came to going downriver, you now had a powered ship. That was something unheard of back then. So you were going downriver much more quickly as well. Technically, there were some rivers you could sail up with, a sailing boat. But for the most part, I mean, I'm assuming everybody here has been on a river. There's a lot of like trees reaching over the river, and that's not very good to have a mast in. And then also, all that tends to block wind currents and make things more difficult. So yeah, sailing up river with a literal sailboat was possible, but very difficult. This made things much better. So this shows the explosion of cities between 1820 and 1860, which is substantial. here the biggest cities we have are, of course, New York, Philadelphia, what is that, Baltimore. And then by 1860, it's just like one big mass of metropolises, which, if you were to drive that now, I've driven up 95 many times going to Rhode Island, it is just that. Once you get past D.C., it is just one big city. It's just constant city traffic. Why is it like this? Yeah, that's why the New Jersey Turnpike is a thing, because you go around all this crap. Or at least part of it in New Jersey. And also, besides these big cities getting much larger, you have other cities showing up. St. Louis wasn't even a thing before 1820, but now it's like a large city. What's that, 100,000 to 250,000? Charleston has existed, hasn't really grown that much. We have Montgomery, Alabama, which we'll actually talk more about next semester as to why it was a thing. New Orleans also grew. What do we have here? And then, of course, these other cities, Cincinnati, Chicago as well, and then other smaller cities that will eventually grow up to be nice big cities. And actually, all of this here, from Buffalo all the way to New York, all these little dots you see here are due to the Erie Canal, but we'll get to that next time. Also, when we're talking about roads, obviously we're not talking about paved roads. There was no kind of paving back then. The closest to paving were basically gravel roads, but not the sort of gravel roads you have today. We have today where it's just like, it's a dirt road and we dump some gravel on it. They had to, of course, clear the road, make it even. Then they would use these real large rocks, and then these smaller rocks on top of it, which they would then level out. But the reason it was these two different types of rocks is for drainage. If it was all the small rocks, it would just collect the water and you'd have a mess. But with the small rocks on top of the large rocks, the water would flow through to the large rocks and then be diverted down into these ditches they've got here to keep the road from flooding. So even back then, gravel roads were pretty impressive. That said, this is still a lot less impressive than, say, Roman roads from like 2,000 years before, but whatever, we can't all be wrong. So here is the length of that road from Baltimore through the Appalachians here, all the way to Illinois. Some were even extended by private funds, but for the most part, it was a federal project. I don't know what this is about. This obviously isn't in the book, but you got National Road built by federal funds, and then proposed but not constructed. But they're the same line. They're the same solid red line. So I don't know what that's about. I don't know if something got lost in translation here with the map, but whatever. Anyway, there's the Clermont, 1807, the first successful steamboat. Obviously, after this point, they became much more efficient, much larger, much better for shipping stuff. But at the time, this was cutting-edge steamboat technology. So, one thing that is important when we talk about the Industrial Revolution is this idea of a multiplier effect, where an invention is created and it affects more than just, well, what it was created for. For example, we have Samuel Slater here. He was born in England and was apprenticed to a textile mill, and he was eventually supposed to inherit it. However, he felt like he could make more money by coming to America and building his own mill and basically creating his own franchise. However, the British didn't want to have competition when it came to textiles, so Slater was not allowed to leave with a machine or blueprints or anything like that. He had to claim he was coming over here to be a farmer because he just decided that, I guess, textiles weren't for him. And then he came over here and was able to, from memory, rebuild one of these machines, which I'll show you in a little bit. These machines are not little simple things. Slater had a heck of a head on his shoulders. And again, used this memory to create a mill that produced yarn in Rhode Island with the backing of the merchant Moses Brown. And the machine design that he had copied was made by Richard Arkwright. This had happened again like 100 years before. But basically it was a machine that, rather than like home sewing, which was, you first would spin it on a wheel and then you would have to like just knit it, sew it together. These put a little bit more power behind it. They were typically powered by a foot pedal, which we'll get more into in a little bit. They do expand that. We, of course, have Eli Whitney, which everyone probably knows because we're in the South. He was the one that created the cotton gin that separated seeds from the short staple cotton. There's different types of cotton. The short staple cotton was really easy to grow, and it grew very fast. But it was very difficult to separate the seed from the cotton, and you can't really use cotton as cloth material until you get all the seeds out. So he was actually, most of Eli Whitney's life is him not having any money. He was traveling around as a traveling tutor and had made friends with Catherine Greene, who was the widow of Nathaniel Greene from the Revolutionary War. And she offered to let him stay at her house for a little while he was, resting before traveling the next leg of his journey. And over dinner one evening, she mentioned that they had all this cotton on their land, but they couldn't really use it because it was short staple cotton. They couldn't grow the long staple cotton because it was the ground and the humidity and all that was just not good for it. So basically overnight, I want to say it was like a day or two that he figured it out. Let me see. Near Savannah, Georgia, local planters complained to him about the difficulty making a profit. Long staple cotton was grown in the Sea Islands, but the soil in most of the South could only sustain short staple. In as little as 10 days. So it wasn't overnight, but it didn't take very long. He created this, the cotton gin, where you would put the cotton in and basically roll this big drum, and it would pull the cotton apart and it would go through these essentially combs that would force the seed out of the cotton. And you would get the cotton on one side and the seeds usually in some kind of repository or even just like dumped out on the ground. And while Whitney immediately got a patent for it so that he could make money, apparently it was so easy to build that people just built their own bootleg versions of it, and he made very little money off of the cotton gin. Despite the fact that, as we're going to see in a little bit, the cotton gin pretty much transformed the economy of the United States. So we have the American system of manufacturing, where they would use machined parts to mass produce interchangeable parts for, in this case specifically guns, but eventually for basically anything. So if you've ever been in any kind of machining shop, they've got the lathes and stuff that you put the part in and it holds it in place so that any machining that you do on it is very precise and, well, interchangeable with anything else. So you can make a bunch of parts and swap them out with other parts. The reason this was a problem was that guns up to this point were made by hand. They were essentially artisan tools. Each gun was made one at a time by a gunsmith, and if a part on the gun broke, you had to throw the whole thing out, because you couldn't just like take, say, the lock mechanism, the part that has the trigger and the actual like flintlock section. You couldn't just take that off and put a different one on, because it wouldn't line up. They weren't even. So this was meant to make that a much easier process. However, I shouldn't get ahead of myself. This was also Eli Whitney. Because he didn't make any money off of the cotton gin, he was going to try to make money with this really big contract from the American government. Let's see. June of 1798, amidst fears of a war with France, the U.S. government granted him an extraordinary contract to produce 4,000 rifles in 18 months. That's like a year and a half. However, here we are. By 1801, having produced only 500 rifles, Eli Whitney was in trouble because he didn't accomplish what he was supposed to. That said, while Eli Whitney technically failed, the idea of producing interchangeable, standardized parts spread throughout pretty much all of American industry. Guns, shoes, wheels, especially when we start getting into things like steamboats and steam engines being more common. Definitely that stuff, so that if a small piece breaks, you can just replace it rather than throw the whole thing out. This isn't quite Samuel Slater's stuff because it's powered. Samuel Slater's machines were pedal powered. This is a little bit later. We'll get to that in a minute as well. But as I've said, when you see stuff like this, there's like a camshaft running along the ceiling that connects to either a water wheel or a steam engine that causes it to turn, and then that transfers this power to these wheels here, and then you attach a belt to that and attach that to the machine, and that belt makes the machine run. Needless to say, there's no kind of like protection that you don't get your arm caught in a belt and get your arm torn off. But hey, that was 1800s industry. There is the cotton gin. This is a small, like, proof of concept version. The actual ones were like this big. And again, you would just like put the cotton in one end, and you turn this crank, and it would force the seed out and dump the, not refined cotton, but at least the seedless cotton out the other end, so you could actually start working with it. It was substantially faster, and caused the price of cotton to plummet, which meant that more people could use it, and, well, I'll get to that in just a minute. Again, machining shop. So you've got those little lathes and whatnot, and you just like put the piece on that, and you lock it in place, and you can grind it out and make it really precise. And again, since this is like early 1800s, these things are powered by an external power source. And as I said, these things that were made by these guys, Samuel Slater, Eli Whitney, etc., other people would take and make better. So over time, the cotton gin, the Arkwright sewing machine would become more and more efficient, which meant that as time progressed, technology became gradually better. And it should be mentioned here that while it's called the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't just like a sudden, we have all this technology, there's steamboats now, and and trains and telegraph lines. It was a really gradual process. Relatively speaking, like historically, it was sudden. But it did take place over years and decades as things were made more and more efficient. For example, Francis Cabot Lowell invented a power loom that allowed for the loom to actually attach to, those belts in the ceiling like I showed you guys. Because with slaters, it was much more fragile. You had to use the pedal to run the machine. With this, you could just hook it up to the external power, again, either a water wheel or a steam engine, and it would run it more or less for you. I mean, obviously, you just had to be there to maintain it, but you didn't have to power it yourself. Jethro Wood perfected a cast iron plow, which was important because as the population moved westward and the cities got bigger, we needed more food to feed all the people in the cities, and that meant that the farmers needed more efficient technology. And this cast iron plow, which again I'll show you guys in a minute, was literally just like a tip that they put on what were typically wooden plows, but it made them more efficient, and they could deal with more strenuous soil. Also, during the Embargo Act, we had an increase in domestic manufacturing because cloth and other items were basically non-existent as far as coming from other countries, so we created our own. Small factories, again, typically along rivers, because we weren't really into steam engines yet. We were largely using water power, which was part of the reason why we were behind when it came to the Industrial Revolution. Britain was using steam engines very early on, whereas we had so many rivers, we just used water wheels because it was cheaper. We also had the idea of companionate marriage, where husbands and wives would work together in whatever domestic pursuits they had. So, again, like we had several chapters back when it came to, a woman's role in society and how men and women are completely different, it usually didn't work with reality. If they had a shoe store or whatever kind of manufacturing, the wife typically was there as much as the husband was. And as we saw with farmers before, these various enterprises would work together, trading tools, skills, and labor with each other so they could all benefit rather than have to fight to be able to use certain technologies that were expensive and hard to come by. Of course, when it came to the southern frontier, it was pretty much slaves doing all the work. There were sometimes hired servants, but for the most part, it was slavery. And that's actually part of the reason why when we get to the Civil War, the North is so much more technologically advanced, because in the South, it was cheaper to just use slave labor. And all this fancy technology would cost a lot of money up front, and why bother when we can just enslave humans? So a lot of households produced and traded locally. Wealthier Americans were now getting into this expanded market economy. For example, families are sewing with this thread spun from machines rather than having to spin it themselves, which was a whole ordeal. They would work in fields with cast iron plows, and not just eating stuff that was grown and produced locally, but stuff from further out due to steamboats being able to ship in food and other goods much more quickly, and therefore before it went bad. We wouldn't have refrigerated transport until the late 1800s. So it was still very much up to how far they could get in a certain amount of time, but with steamboats, it was a substantial difference. So here is the Lowell machines. Again, you've got the little camshaft thing up here in the ceiling that ran these belts that actually ran the machines. And of course, most of the people working in these factories, especially the Lowell textile mills specifically, would typically only hire young women because they could pay them less. So, economy. Here's the cast iron plow. Typically, this would be made of oftentimes wood or just like some wrought iron, and they would put this cast iron tip on the end so that they could tear through the soil much more efficiently. Eventually, again, this will be next semester, we get to a steel-tipped plow, which was actually invented by John Deere. We think of John Deere, we think of the tractors, but actually John Deere made his fortune off of basically taking this and going, but what is steel though? And it ended up being way better than cast iron. But we'll get to that later. All right. With this technological change, it was felt largely in agriculture, and when it comes to agriculture, that means the South. When it comes to technological advancement in the South, that's going to be the cotton gin. It spread both cotton and slavery across the southern states and into the Mississippi River Valley because, well, when you can grow and process cotton so much more quickly and so much more efficiently, just about everybody can get in on the cotton game. But also, you still don't want to work the land yourself, so slavery continues to increase through this time. Now, cotton was not the only thing people were growing. A lot of times you would just see that simplification of, oh, it was just cotton. And I will probably say that, but I mean it, not metaphorically. I'm exaggerating to some degree. But like cotton did end up being like 2/3 of the American economy there right before the Civil War. But there were still places that grew things in large quantities. For example, in Louisiana, they grew a lot of sugar. Here in South Carolina, we often grew rice down in the southern bits, or not the southern, the low country, the eastern parts of the state. So just to give an idea of how quickly this stuff progressed, again, you don't need to know these numbers, but I just like to illustrate this. So 1790, just as the cotton gin was being invented and not quite in the market yet, we produced 3,000 bales of cotton, each bale weighing about 300 pounds apiece. Whereas by 1820, with the cotton gin well into production, production increased to 330,000 bales. So we went up by a factor of like 110. Yeah, that's a hell of a thing. Obviously, all this cotton being grown and harvested and produced meant that slavery also dramatically increased. In 1790, there were about 700,000 slaves. By 1820, it had gone up to about 500,000, or 1.5 million, I should say. So more than doubled. This also happened at a time when the transatlantic slave trade had ended, which is to say, Britain wouldn't let us do it anymore. And when one country controls the ocean, what they say tends to go. So after 1808, people were no longer being kidnapped from Africa and brought over as slaves, so the population increase had to occur naturally. So we had to, the slave populations had to reproduce on their own. So technically, this made the lives of slaves a little bit better. I'm not going to be like, oh, well, see, it was fine because now the masters couldn't murder them. It certainly wasn't fine, but slave owners had to allow their slaves to live long enough to increase their population. And also, like, each slave was becoming a more valuable commodity because you couldn't just, like, send a ship off to Africa to kidnap more people. Which is why I have said since, like, the beginning of the semester that while American slavery was horrendous, it was still somehow worse in, like, the Caribbean and especially Brazil because they just worked them to death. They just worked them until they dropped, and they threw them in a hole or whatever and brought in more. With the American slavery system, they couldn't really do that because you now couldn't just go get more. Southern slaves also established their own religious ceremonies, not just which was this syncretic religion. That's going to be one of the first things next semester. It's this combination of, their traditions from Africa, often traditions from the Caribbean as well, and then whatever region they were in, and they would just meld those together into something entirely new. So here we have the increase in cotton production, with the cotton gin being created, as you can see here, in, 1787? So about 1790, it started to jump, and then by 1860, it was substantially higher than down here. And then, of course, you have just both the graphs laid on top of one another, the slave population and cotton production increasing together over time. I also would like to look at this map real quick, and this is actually something I saw online. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. So you can see where cotton production is at this highest. Sorry, that's slavery. Yeah, it is. Sometimes I forget which one's which. Cotton production is at its highest, is where slavery is much more widespread. In particular, along the Mississippi, as you can see, and this little belt in Alabama here, this little U shape. I actually saw it was 4 maps of this region. 2 of them were these 2. The first one was, no, there were more than just 4. It doesn't matter. Anyway, there were a bunch of Alabama. The first one was all the way back in the, how long ago was it now? Several 100,000, maybe a few million years ago, when America had that big inland sea, where like a lot of the middle region here was underwater. And this was like the coastline of that inland sea. So when the water eventually receded and evaporated, this was left with a lot of silt, a lot of really fertile soil. So obviously, come these big agricultural ventures, this was very, very highly sought after because the soil was so fertile. So this is where a lot of cotton was grown. And, as we've been saying, this increase in cotton meant an increase in slavery because they didn't feel like running the thing themselves. And then this expands into, after the Civil War, it's a much higher African-American population in that region because when you're freed from slavery, you have nothing, and for like 100 freaking years, the government didn't do a damn thing to help, so people couldn't really move out. So there's this large population of African-American citizens in this region, which in turn, it then went to a voting map obviously Alabama is deep red, except for right here. That tends to vote a little more blue. So going back as far as literally the prehistoric days of an inland sea creating fertile soil, which meant more cotton, which meant more slaves, which has now even expanded into today with a shift in population and how they vote politically. And that's actually it for this chapter. The expansion between 1790 and 1820 allowed for advances, which changed the American identity pretty dramatically. Some people were able to take advantage of this, but many were very much left behind, which is to say, where were we at? Great oppression on African Americans and, of course, Native Americans, because any expansion meant that their land was taken from them, and any attempt for them to try to not let it be taken led to them being murdered. Even though we do have like 10 minutes left, I'm not going to bother getting into the next chapter. So we will do chapter 9 next week. So I will see y'all then.